Good evening, everyone. It is so good to be with you tonight. It is November the 25th. We are in the week of Thanksgiving already, with Christmas looming very, very soon. And it's hard to even believe that I'm saying that out loud. So, happy Thanksgiving to everyone this week. And if you didn't see my email, just a few dates to throw out there for you that are upcoming, okay? And by the way, those of you that are watching, you are welcome to come to our Christmas party. So tonight is going to be Exodus part 1, and then next week is Exodus part 2. The following week will be Leviticus. And then on December the 16th, here in the chapel, we're going to have a Christmas party. So we're just going to have everybody bring, I already got permission, we can have food that night. So everyone can bring like some, a little finger food or a dessert or something. And we will just have a time of fellowship and celebration together that night. And then we are going to break until January. So on the 23rd and the 30th of December, we are not going to meet because those are holiday weeks and it's crazy. And everyone can take their time off. And then January the 6th, we will meet back and start with the Book of Numbers. Okay? So that is the plan, subject to change, but that's what we anticipate having for our plan. So those of you that are watching, if you want to come in person on December the 16th, then you are more than welcome to come. We would love to have you. I see Betty's watching. Hi. And by the way, for those of you that are watching, if you comment and I don't see it, it might be because it doesn't display it to me. So after the video's over and I go home, I see all these comments that came in that I never even saw. So sometimes it doesn't even tell me you're even on. So I apologize if that happens. But just know that I love you and I will respond to your comments. And hi, Beth Ann. Good to see you. So tonight we are going to be in the book of Exodus, and this is going to be a part 1, part 2. Now, tonight I'm going to attempt to get through the whole story of Exodus in this lesson because there's so much to talk about Jesus in the book of Exodus, with the law, with Passover, there's so many things that I want to dive into deep next week. So we're going to try to get through the whole story of Exodus tonight, and then next week we'll talk about how Jesus Christ is seen, and I'm so excited about that lesson as well. So if you remember from our timeline, on your paper, if you have your paper timeline, so Exodus, you can see the patriarchs here, and Joseph and the Egyptian slavery, somewhere between like 18 and 1900 BC, okay? Because if you remember, Abraham is roughly 2000 BC. And so if you follow that down to the world history, we're in the Egyptian dynasties. So on our chart here, if you're kind of following along, all of these, so Joseph is here, where we just were, right? And then we're going to have like a 400-year gap between Genesis and Exodus. So Joseph, what did we say? It was between like 1900 BC. And then we've got a gap after that. And so we're looking at probably, let's see, they've got Joseph here, 1817. So we're going to be somewhere down in here instead. But here's Egypt, right down here. And on this timeline, they have Ramses II here at about 1304 BC. Okay? So that's where we're talking. Now, if you remember from last time, all the pyramids and everything were built even well before that, which is crazy to me to think about how old those things actually are. I would love to see them in person, but I don't want to go to Egypt because it's not safe, so we'll just watch them on the computer. So anyway, so the book itself covers roughly 50 years, starting with the Exodus from Egypt, story, and covers the next about 50 years. We already talked about the Egyptian rule, probably during Ramses the first and second, are the pharaohs around this time. And then they have a couple other listed here. Seti the first and Merneptah, which I don't know how to say that, but whoever that is, there you go. That's what the scholars say. So our author is Moses, just like for Genesis. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, so you're going to hear his name quite a lot over the next several weeks. Written somewhere between 1450 to 1410 BC, just like we saw in Genesis. Now, the word Exodus, if you think about the word itself, it means in Greek, way out. It's a departure. So it's a continuation of the story that began in Genesis. And in our the book that I got some of these outlines from, Henrietta Mears, What the Bible is All About, she says that Exodus is the thrilling epic of God hastening to the rescue. It tells of the redeeming work of a sovereign God, which we are going to see in our storyline. So Exodus is the book of redemption in the Old Testament. Very, very important. We can view the book of Exodus as an example for us, God's way of delivering sinful people and his gracious purposes in rescuing them. So if you have your notes in front of you, major themes and characters we're going to see. Egypt can represent allegiance to the world rather than to God. We have our great hero Moses and his brother Aaron. We have Joshua that's introduced as Moses' assistant, and obviously he's going to be very important in the story later. Obviously a big theme is the Exodus from Egypt, and the law is given, and then all the notes about the tabernacle. So I will just interrupt myself to say that there's way more. We could study Exodus for months and months and months and months. There's so much here. So this is going to be the highlights, and the next week we'll talk specifically about Jesus Christ. So let's go to the outline of the book. If you remember from Genesis, it ended with the people of Jacob's family. Remember, there was the big famine. We had Joseph, and he was brought up, and he was put in charge of all of that. He was sent ahead by God, we saw, to prepare the way for all of this to work out. And because of that famine, his dad and all of his brothers and the whole family end up coming down to Egypt from Israel. And they all end up being in Egypt reunited together. And we say reunited because, remember, Jacob thought that Joseph was dead because of the little stunt the brothers pulled all those years before. At the time when they came to Egypt, the Bible says there were 70 members of Jacob's family when they began their lives in Egypt after escaping the plague. All right? Then we have this gap of about 400 years that the Bible doesn't talk about what happened. But we can know a few things for sure. The people of Israel settled in the land of Egypt, and they greatly multiplied in number. So they started out as 70, and they reached about 3 million people in those 400 years. Now, remember, especially back then, people had lots and lots of kids. And so they grew exponentially and became extremely powerful, and they filled the land. Remember, they were in the land of Goshen, is what it says there in Genesis. Then, if you look at Exodus 1 verse 8, we won't read tons of scriptures tonight. We will read most of the scriptures about Exodus next week. But Exodus 1:8 to me is a very sad verse. And it says, eventually a new king came to power in Egypt who knew nothing about Joseph or what he had done. And I've always thought, why? How does that even happen? I mean, 400 years of history in the grand scheme of life isn't really that much. Now, if you look at it, that depends on your perspective. In the history of our country, sure it is, right? Because there were people just starting to explore the land and stuff 400 years ago. Like, our nation wasn't a nation that long ago. So a lot in our country has happened in 400 years. So in that perspective, you think, okay, but we still know, and of course we have technology and stuff now, but we still know what happens when things, how it all started and all of that. So it's very, very interesting to me that it says that this new Pharaoh came in and didn't know anything about Joseph or what had happened. So anyway, he realizes that the Israelites are very, very powerful and they're outnumbering the Egyptians. And so he decides to make the Israelites slaves to the Egyptians. And the more that the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites, the Bible says the more they expanded. It's like you can't get a good guy down. I mean, the more that they were beat up on, the more that they just grew. And the slave drivers, the Bible says, were unmerciful. And they made them work very, very, very hard, especially in building things for Pharaoh. So because of that, the Pharaoh instructs all the midwives to start killing all of the new baby boys that are born to the Israelites. But the midwives feared God and wouldn't do it. And they give an excuse, oh, we can't help it. They just have their babies so fast we don't get there in time. So they were not going to follow those orders. So then the Pharaoh instructs his people to start throwing all of the newborn male Israelite babies into the Nile River. And the Bible talks about all of that. And it's very, very sad. Now, during this time, we have an Israelite couple that has a baby boy. And they obviously didn't want their baby to be thrown into the river. What parents would want that to happen? So they hide him, but eventually, you can only hide him so long, right? You guys understand how children are. They're not silent, and it's very, very hard to keep that under wraps. So the mother's name is Jochebed, and she makes a basket. And she puts her baby in it, and she places that basket in the river in order to save his life. So the baby's older sister kind of stays along the riverbank and watches the basket to see what happens to the basket. And the Pharaoh's daughter finds this basket with this baby inside crying. And she decides that she's going to keep him, even though she knew he was an Israelite child. Obviously, she said, this must be an Israelite child. I'm sure they could tell the difference, right? I'm sure they looked different. And why would there be an Egyptian baby in a basket, hiding? That doesn't make sense. So she knew that it was an Israelite child. And so the child's sister, who we know as Miriam, she came out and asked the Pharaoh's daughter if she would like her to get a nursemaid for the baby. And the Pharaoh's daughter said, sure, that'd be great. So Miriam gets to go home and get mama. And so Moses' own mother gets to nurse him and keep him until he is older, which is just really a beautiful story of God saving him and keeping them reunited. So then Jochebed did fulfill her promise, and she took Moses back to the palace and gave him to Pharaoh's daughter, who adopted him as her own. And she named him Moses because she had lifted him out of the water. And that's what his name means. So that is in Exodus chapter 2. Now Moses grows up in the Pharaoh's household, obviously. And as he's out one day, after he grew up, he is seeing how hard that his people are being worked. And he sees an Egyptian beating one of the Hebrew men, and Moses thinks that nobody's watching, and he killed that Egyptian, buried his body in the sand, and thought he got away with it. And then the next day, he's out there visiting his people again, and there's two Israelites that are fighting with each other. And so Moses, tries to stop the fight, and they're like, what? Are you going to kill us like you killed that Egyptian yesterday? And he's like, uh-oh. I guess I didn't get away with that. And the Bible does say that the Pharaoh knew, and he was angry, obviously. So Moses is afraid, and he flees because Pharaoh tries to kill him. And so he goes and he lives in the land of Midian. And that is in the chapter 2, verse 11 through 15. While he's in Midian, he saves some young women from some shepherds who are bothering them. And so when they went home and told their dad, hey, this guy protected us from the shepherds that are bothering us, and he rescued us. And so their father's name was Jethro, and in the Bible he's also called Reuel, however you say that. And he invites Moses to come and stay with the family. And eventually he gives Moses his daughter Zipporah as a wife. And Moses and Zipporah have a son named Gershom, which you will see in the lineage later on. Chapter 2, verse 16 through 22. So, during the years that Moses is away, the Pharaoh dies, but the Israelites are still under the burden of slavery. And they cry out to God, who remembers his covenant with Abraham. Now, by the way, God didn't forget. So when the Bible says that God remembered his covenant, that doesn't mean that he forgot about it and they had to remind him, dear Lord, don't you remember about your covenant? Oh yeah, I did make a covenant with that guy Abraham back, 500 years ago or whatever. But God says, yes, I have this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and it's time to do something about that covenant. Okay? So, he decides that it's time to act, and that's in chapter 2, verse 25. All right? So now we come to the Exodus itself, in letter B in your outline. So, Moses is minding his own business, and he is out tending his father-in-law's sheep, and he is hanging out in the wilderness, and he comes to Sinai, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appears to him in the middle of a burning bush. I love this story. So Moses sees the bush. I'm sure he's seen things on fire before. This probably isn't a new phenomenon. But he notices that this bush is not burning up. It's just on fire, like a continual fire. And he's like, this is interesting. So he comes in to get a closer look at this phenomenon. And God calls to him out of the middle of the bush. And he tells Moses, don't step any closer, because you are on holy ground. Take off your sandals. You're on holy ground. And when God tells Moses who he is, Moses covers his face in fear. He's terrified. I would be terrified. I don't know about you guys. But God tells Moses that he has heard the Israelites' cries, and he's going to rescue them from the Egyptians. He will send the Israelites to the land that he's promised them. And he tells Moses that he is sending him to the Pharaoh to lead the people out of Egypt. And Moses is like, time out. I don't know about that, God, because, I think you could find someone different. And so Moses feels inadequate. Moses is like, I don't speak very well. I get tongue-tied. I don't think I'm your guy. And God says that he will be with Moses. And so Moses asks God who he should say has sent him. And God tells Moses, I am who I am. Amazing. He also tells Moses, and by the way, that's all capitalized. He tells Moses to say that Jehovah, which is God's eternal name, has sent him. When the Israelite leaders accept Moses, Moses, I'm tongue-tied. I'm Moses. So let's see here. So then God says, when the Israelite leaders accept you as their leader, you're going to go to Pharaoh and demand that he lets the people go. I wrote that weird, so I couldn't say it. God tells Moses that he's going to give him all sorts of signs to show the Pharaoh, but that Pharaoh's heart will be hardened. Moses is like, I still am not too sure about this. So God gives Moses right there all sorts of signs to prove that he is God. And he tells Moses, you're going to perform those signs if they don't believe you. And Moses still complains. He says he gets tongue-tied and he can't speak properly. And God reminds Moses, I'm the one that created you, and I will give you the words to say. And Moses still pleads with God to send someone else. And God gets angry at that. And he says, all right, I will send your brother Aaron with you. That all happens in chapters 3 and 4. Okay? So in chapter 5, we see that Moses and Aaron go and they get back to Egypt. And they go first to the Israelite leaders to tell them all about what happened and to convince them that God has sent them. And then they go to the Pharaoh and they demand that he lets the people go. Well, Pharaoh's like, no. So he demands that the slave drivers continue to make it even harder on the slaves, and they make them still have the same quota of bricks, but you got to go find your own straw. We're not going to give you the straw to help you do that. You got to figure that out. Well, that makes it so much worse for the slaves. So then they get mad at Moses and Aaron, like, what are you guys doing to us? Now it's worse than it was before. So it's a very, very difficult time for Moses and Aaron, as you can imagine. So God reminds Moses and Aaron several times in chapter 6, I am the Lord. And he sends them to encourage the people with what God has promised them. And that's something that we can always remember, is thinking and remembering on the things that God has promised. When things are tough, when things don't make sense, when we are in pain, when we are hurt, when we are pleading for the life of a loved one, when we lost our job, when whatever it is in our life, we have a sickness that we're dealing with. Remember the goodness of God. Remember the promises that he has made. Excuse me, I have a tickle. And that's exactly what Moses and Aaron do with the people. Now, the people don't really want to listen. They're still discouraged because it's very hard. And then in the rest of chapter 6, we have the genealogy of Moses and Aaron's ancestors that are given there in chapter 6. Now, in chapter 7, God tells Moses and Aaron to go back in front of Pharaoh and to show them the miracle of Aaron's staff turning into a snake. Which, I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have liked to see this one. That would have scared me. I don't like snakes. But, so they do this miracle in front of Pharaoh, but then Pharaoh's like, I got guys that can do that, so he calls all of his magicians out, and they are able to do the same thing. So he's like, who are you? You know, my guys can do the same thing. So Pharaoh's heart remains hard. And the Bible makes it clear here, and I think it's really interesting that they put this in. Moses, by the way, is 80 years old, and Aaron is 83 when they go before Pharaoh. Just so you know. So they were not young chickens, okay? Then God starts to send plague after plague to the Egyptians to show himself mighty, but the Pharaoh's heart remains hard. So in between all of these plagues, they go back to the Pharaoh, and he's like, nope. And then the plague comes, and then he's like, please, please, please pray to your God to get rid of this. And so they do, and then the plague goes away, and then the Pharaoh's like, nope, I'm not letting your people go. And it just happens over and over and over and over, okay? So here's all of the plagues. So starting in chapter 7, verse 14, we've got the water turning to blood. And then we've got the frogs. Ew. That starts in chapter 8. In chapter 8 we have frogs, and then we have gnats. Ugh. Flies. Flies are nasty.
But didn't we notice the frogs after the hurricane? These teeny little babies.
Yes. There were a lot of frogs after the hurricane. You're right. Yeah. Frogs. You look at a frog and you say, "Don't jump on me," and it's going to jump on you. That's what frogs do. Then in chapter 9, they had the disease to the livestock. They have the boils that come out on their skin. They have the hail that just destroys everything. And then in chapter 10, they have the locusts, which, oh my gosh, I don't know, that one might be the hardest one for me. Because, I don't know, grasshoppers and locusts are so gross to me. And they just destroy everything, and they're hopping all over. And then darkness. Now that one is really interesting because it's like, you know, just thinking about how darkness could be used as a weapon. I don't know if you guys ever really thought about that, but if you've ever been in like a cave or something, a place where you literally can feel the darkness, which doesn't make sense if you've never experienced it. It's like, how can you feel darkness? But it's like you can, because it's so pitch black. You literally can't see anything right in front of your face. Even if you know your hand is right there, you cannot see it. You can feel it. And so that can definitely be something bad that can happen. And then, of course, the very last plague is death for Egypt's firstborn. And that is in chapter 11 and part of chapter 12. Now, we're going to come back to that later, mostly next week, okay? When we talk about Passover. So, before the people are able to leave Egypt, it was finally after the 10th plague, and the Bible says that every single household in Egypt was affected, but not the Israelites, because they followed God's command to put the blood on the door, which we will talk about in detail next week. But Pharaoh finally says, "Go, get out of here." You know, in a couple, like before, he was like, "Well, you can take some of your people, but you got to leave the women and children back." Nope, we're all going. Well, what about that? Nope. So this time he's finally like, "Get out." And so before they leave, they have their first Passover that we will talk about next week in Exodus part 2. And so when the Pharaoh orders them to leave, they gather their bread dough, their kneading boards, and the Bible says that the Egyptians looked favorably on the people, and they were able to take with them clothing and silver and gold that they collected from the Egyptians. Very interesting. Which is so cool, because then God ends up using that later in all of the building and all of the things that are going to come, which is really interesting. The Israelites had lived in Egypt for 430 years when God kept his promise and brought them back out of Egypt. So we have the Exodus. That's why the book is called that, out of the land of Egypt. And in chapter 12, verse 51, it says that they came out like an army. Which you could imagine, if there was 3 million of them all leaving at the same time. I mean, I've never seen 3 million people, walking towards me, but that would certainly look like an army if I saw that. So, they leave Egypt, but God doesn't bring them straight to the promised land. He brings them in a roundabout way through the wilderness towards the Red Sea. Moses takes the bones of Joseph with him as promised. That was something that Joseph had made them promise hundreds of years earlier. And God goes ahead of the Israelites, guiding them with a pillar of cloud during the day and a pillar of fire during the night. And God orders the Israelites to camp in a certain place. And Pharaoh's heart hardened again. And he decides, what? do? I let all of my slaves go. That was dumb. So here we go. We're going to chase after them. So Pharaoh and all of his troops, 600 of his best chariots, started chasing after them. That would be loud if you heard that coming. That would be scary, right? So the people of Israel panic. And they blame Moses and Aaron for bringing them to this wilderness to die. And you'll see this throughout the next couple of books. We should have stayed in Egypt. It was so much better there. How quickly they forget, right? Because they come face to face with something that's scary to them. So they forget all the bad that they went through. And it was much better back then. It's like, were we in the same place? Because I don't think it was, So Moses tells the people to stand still and watch the Lord rescue them. That is in chapter 14, verse 5 through 14. Stand still and watch the Lord rescue. Oh, amazing. And God says, I've done this in order to display myself. So, God tells Moses to pick up his staff and to raise his hand over the sea and divide the water so the Israelites can walk through the middle of the sea on dry ground. Now, guys, if you've ever heard someone that's trying to debunk the Bible, I've heard crazy things about people say this wasn't really the actual Red Sea. This was something different, and they try to make it sound like, they just walked through this little puddle or something. Guys, this was a great body of water that starts standing up on end right in the middle, okay? So the angel of God, it says, moves to the back of the Israelite camp, and he places a cloud of fire in between the Israelites and Egyptians to keep them apart during the night while this miracle is happening. And Moses raised his hand. God opens that path through the water with a strong wind that blows all night long. And the people of Israel walk through the middle of the sea with walls of water on each side. And the Egyptians chase them into the sea, but God throws their forces into total confusion, and their chariot wheels start falling off, and there's all this trouble that they're trying to get through. And as soon as those Israelites get through to the other side, God tells Moses to raise his hand back over the sea again, and the water rushes back and into its usual place, and obviously completely covers them. So the people that say that the Red Sea really wasn't that big would be like, well, then what kind of miracle would that be to have all of those Egyptians drown in just a tiny bit of water? That's an even bigger miracle if you think about it. So, I always picture, I mentioned the movie The Prince of Egypt, and it's so good. It was a DreamWorks movie, but they really did a good job with it. And I just remember the part where they're walking through the Red Sea and you see the whale swimming by, just on the edge of this giant wall of water, creative license. But, it kind of brings it to life. This was a serious, big, giant body of water. Okay.
Us going to stand in the ocean.
Yeah.
Getting ready.
Yeah. Yeah. Even even just picture going over to Lake Monroe and just standing on the edge of it, and just that whole thing just stands up, and you could walk, from Sanford over across into, whatever it's called on the other side, Enterprise. Okay, that would be a pretty crazy feat, right? So this was a huge, huge miracle. Now, obviously all the Egyptians were killed, and the people of Israel are filled with awe before the Lord, and they put their faith in him, and they believe Moses. So they see this big, giant miracle, and all of a sudden Moses is the hero because they just experienced this huge miracle. They'll forget about that pretty soon, though. So in chapter 15, Moses and the people sing a song to the Lord about how he has triumphed gloriously. And, just kind of one of the precedents for musical worship to the Lord in the Bible. Then Moses leads the people into the desert, and they go for 3 days without finding any water. So this is in the latter part of chapter 15. They find an oasis at a place called Mara, but the water's too bitter to drink. They cry out to Moses, who asks God for help. And God has Moses toss a piece of wood into the water, and it makes the water good to drink. And God sets before the Israelites a standard to test their faithfulness to him. And he tells them that if they listen carefully to God and do what is right and obey his commands and his decrees that he's going to give them, that he will not make them suffer diseases. He makes them a promise there. Of course, they don't do that. So, as they continue through the wilderness, they complain because they're hungry. We wish we were back in Egypt because at least we had food, and they're complaining again. Some of these, like when we look at it from now, and we look back at it, and we see what God did, and we see the miracles, like how could you possibly go through that huge miracle of getting out of a place of torment and walking through the giant body of water and all of the things that God is providing for you, and then you're hungry, so you're like, you want to go back to Egypt? It does not make any sense to me. So,
We do it though.
here we go. Where was I?
Kathy, can I share something?
Yes, please. Here, appreciate it. Yes, go ahead.
I have a John Maxwell Leadership Bible, so he brings out leadership tips.
Uh-huh.
And I thought this was fascinating here, is like in the plagues, as we get ready to go on now, in the plagues, the first 4, Aaron did them. In the first 5, Aaron used God's staff, and Moses watched. The 6th plague, Aaron and Moses worked together to summon the plague of boils. And the last 4 plagues, Moses worked alone as Aaron watched. It's kind of like an apprentice. So from here on out, he's gained that confidence in that leader. Now for the rest of Exodus,
That's good.
he's going and being a leader.
Yeah, that's great. I love that.
I thought that was a good segue.
That's a good insight there. Moses had to get the confidence. And so, God using Aaron to help him, that's why they made a good team, I think. And they were brothers, so what a cool thing to do together, right? So, they're complaining that they're hungry, so God sends a huge number of quail that evening for them to eat. And then he introduces manna to them. This is a food that God sends each night, and it covers the ground like frost every morning. And the people were to gather 2 quarts for each person, and no more, or it would go bad, on each day, okay? And then on the 6th day, they were to collect twice as much so that they could rest on the Sabbath. And God said, and the food won't go bad on that day if you do it this way. And then as the sun rose up in the sky, the manna would melt. The rest of it would melt and go away till the next day. And the manna is described as being like white like coriander seed and tasted like honey wafers. That's in chapter 16. That doesn't sound too hateful, right? He didn't make it taste like, sardines or something. Just off the top of my head, I don't know. Something gross, it wasn't liver or whatever. So, then the people complain about being thirsty again. Surprise, surprise. So God instructs Moses to strike a rock, and water gushes out for the people. And that's in chapter 17. Then, in the rest of chapter 17, there are some warriors from Amalek that attack the Israelites. But Moses tells Joshua to choose some men to fight, and Moses stands at the top of the hill and holds his staff up. And as long as he's holding up the staff, The Israelites have the advantage. But when his arms get tired and he sits down, whatever, if his arm dropped, then the other side would have the advantage. So Moses is exhausted, so he's able to sit down, and he had Aaron on one side and a man named Hur on the other side, and they held up his hands. And because of that, Joshua's army defeated the Amalekites. And God tells Moses to write down a remembrance of the battle as a permanent reminder. Awesome story. Well, Moses' father-in-law, Jethro, comes to visit him in the wilderness, and Jethro recognizes that Moses has way too much on his plate. Moses is trying to solve all of the disputes of the people all by himself. And he recommends, he's like, Moses, this is way too much. There's way too many people. I don't know about y'all, but if you've ever been in any kind of leadership over even a small group of people, it's a lot of work. So I couldn't even imagine being in leadership over 3 million people all by yourself. That's crazy. So he recommends that Moses appoint other men to help him hear all of the disputes, and that they will only come to him with the bigger stuff. And Moses takes his wise advice. That's in chapter 18. And then in chapter 19, 2 months after the Israelites left Egypt, all this happened in 2 months, okay? Moses climbs Mount Sinai to appear before God. And God reaffirms his covenant with the Israelites and returns to tell the people everything God had commanded. The people said that they would obey, so Moses brings their answer back to God, and God tells Moses to go down and prepare the people for his arrival and to keep them away from the mountain. And then on the morning of the 3rd day, thunder roars and lightning flashes and a dense cloud comes down. There is a long, loud blast from a ram's horn, and everyone is terrified. It says they trembled. They didn't know what was going on. And Moses leads the people out of the camp to meet with God, and they stand at the foot of the mountain. And God comes down on the top of the mountain and calls Moses up to meet with him. And then God tells Moses to go back down, to bring up Aaron with him, and to tell the people, do not come and approach the mountain. Okay? So, we come to letter C in the outline, the giving of the law. All right? In chapter 20, you guys are probably very familiar with Exodus chapter 20. We get the 10 Commandments. So, no other gods before him. Do not make any idols or graven images. Do not misuse the name of the Lord. Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. Honor your father and mother. Do not murder. Do not commit adultery. Do not steal. Do not testify falsely against your neighbor. And do not covet anything that belongs to someone else. Then God gives them instructions on the proper use of altars, the fair treatment of slaves, how to settle cases of personal injury, how to protect your property, what social responsibilities they have, how they need to keep justice. He gives them 3 annual festivals to celebrate, which is the Festival of Unleavened Bread, the Festival of Harvest, and the Festival of the Final Harvest. And those are all given in chapters 20 through 23. God gives them a promise of his presence, and he warns the people to be careful to obey all of his commandments and not to intermingle with the people of the land. Very important command that they end up not listening to. So, but Israel accepts the Lord's covenant for now. Moses carefully writes down all of God's instructions, and then they present offerings to the Lord. Moses reads the covenant to the people, and again, they will say, we will obey everything God commanded, in chapter 24, verse 1 through 8. Then Moses, Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel then climb up the mountain. By the way, Nadab and Abihu are Aaron's oldest 2 sons. 70 elders of Israel climb up the mountain, and this is a cool story. They get to see God and eat a covenant meal in his presence, but they don't die. Crazy. God tells Moses to come up farther up, where God gives him the tablets of stone where he had inscribed the instructions. And Moses brings Joshua with him, but he tells the other elders to wait. And the glory of the Lord covers Mount Sinai for 6 days, and then God calls to Moses from the cloud. Moses disappears higher into the cloud as he climbs up, and he remains on the mountain for 40 days with the Lord. That is in chapter 24. All right? So, now, the tabernacle. During this time, so this is chapters 25 through 31, God gives Moses the plans for the tabernacle that they're to build and other instructions. And this is what it includes. Acceptable offerings for the tabernacle, plans for the Ark of the Covenant, the table of showbread, the lampstand, the tabernacle itself, the altar of burnt offering, plans for the courtyard, light for the tabernacle, clothing for the priests, design of the ephod, design of the chest piece, additional clothing for the priests, dedication of the priests, plans for the incense altar, money for the tabernacle, plans for the wash basin, the anointing oil, the incense. He says that the craftsmen for the tabernacle are going to be 2 craftsmen named Bezalel and Aholiab. And he gives instructions for the Sabbath. All of that and more in chapters 25 through 31. Okay? So God gives Moses the 2 stone tablets inscribed with the term of the covenant, written by the finger of God. Chapter 31. Now, very interesting story happens after this in chapter 32. The people think that it's taken this guy Moses way too long to come back down the mountain. And they start to get antsy. And so they ask Aaron to make some gods for them who can lead them. And so Aaron instructs the people to bring all their gold earrings to him. He melts them down and he molds the gold into the shape of a calf. This is Aaron. This is Moses' brother. This is the dude that is going to be the first high priest. This is the dude that just helped do those miracles, right? And showed Moses what to do and helped him with the Pharaoh and all of the things, right? So the people are so excited because they have this calf now. And so Aaron builds an altar in front of the calf. He says they're going to have a festival to the Lord, and the people wake up early and they offer burnt offerings and peace offerings. They celebrate with feasting, drinking, and pagan revelry as a feast to the Lord, right? And I'm doing that in quotes. God tells Moses, get down the mountain and that I'm going to destroy the people. And Moses intercedes on their behalf, and he reminds God that other nations are going to think that God rescued them just to take them out into the wilderness and slaughter them. And so he's like, come on, God, what would that do for your reputation? That wouldn't be so good. And he reminds God of his covenant with the people. And so God says, okay, I won't destroy them. So Moses goes down the mountain. He meets up with Joshua. Joshua thinks there's a war in the camp because he hears all this noise. And Moses tells him what's really going on because God told him. They reach the camp, and Moses smashes the stone tablets that have the 10 Commandments on the ground in his anger. He burns the calf that they made, grinds it into powder, throws it in the water, and forces the people to drink it. And then he demands Aaron, what is going on? Right? He is upset. And Aaron blames it on the people. Y'all. Okay. Chapter 32. In verse 22, Aaron says, don't get so upset, my lord. Aaron replied, you yourself know how evil these people are. They said to me, make us gods who will lead us. We don't know what happened to this fellow Moses who brought us here from the land of Egypt. So I told them, whoever has gold jewelry, take it off. When they brought it to me, I simply threw it into this fire and out came this calf. Really? That was his story. Crazy. So, Moses shouts to the people to see who is on the Lord's side, and the Levites join him. God instructs the Levites to start killing the people, and about 3,000 people die that day. Moses goes back to the mountains to ask God's forgiveness for the people's sin, but God holds the people accountable, and he sends a plague. And then God says that he's now going to send an angel before them, but he's not going to travel himself with them among the people himself. So the people go into mourning, and they stop wearing their jewelry and fine clothes. Moses sets up the tent of meeting outside of where they camp. And this is a cool thing. During this time, Moses would go into the tent, and then the pillar of the cloud would come and hover while the Lord spoke with Moses. And when the people saw the cloud, they would stand and bow down in front of their tents. And inside the tent of meeting, the Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one speaks to a friend, the Bible says. And then Moses would return to camp, but his assistant Joshua would remain behind in the tent of meeting and get more instructions. Moses asked God to let him know God's way so he can more fully understand him. God promises to personally go with Moses, and Moses asks to see God's glorious presence. Do you guys remember this story? God says he will make his goodness pass before Moses, but that he could not look at God's face. He covers Moses in a crevice of a rock while he passes by, and he only lets Moses see him from behind. And Moses throws himself to the ground in worship. That's his response. That's all he can do, is just throw himself on the ground, just by seeing the backside of the Lord. God reinforces his covenant and commandments with Moses. Moses is on the mountain for 40 days again. He fasts the entire time. God writes down the 10 Commandments again on 2 new tablets. And when Moses comes down off the mountain, his face is radiant because he had spoken to God. And the people are afraid, but Moses gives the people the terms of the covenant again, reminds them what they have to do, and he covers his face with a veil until he goes into the tent of meeting, and then he would remove it while he spoke to the Lord. Now, Moses, in chapters 35 through 40, which is the end of Exodus, Moses calls together the Israelites, gives them all the instructions that God had given to him regarding the tabernacle. And the people give so much money. This is crazy. They actually had to tell them to stop giving because they had enough. I have never been in a church where the people gave so much money that the pastors are like, whoa, stop giving money. We have plenty, right? But the people were so excited about the tabernacle and what God was doing. They carry out the instructions of the Lord in building the tabernacle, all the sacred items, the priest's clothing, and the tabernacle is complete, and the Lord's glory fills the tabernacle. And Moses can no longer enter the tabernacle because the glory of the Lord filled it. And whenever the cloud lifted from the tabernacle, the Israelites would pack up everything, and they would follow the cloud to the next place, and God would tell them where to camp. And they remained where they were if the cloud stayed, or if the cloud moved, they would follow it. And this continued throughout all of their journeys coming up that we're going to see in the next few books, okay? That's Exodus in a nutshell, a very fast nutshell. Now, next week, we're going to pick up with where the New Testament is seen and how Christ is seen. We're going to...
Very good.
We're going to go into much more detail about how Jesus is seen in the law and in the tabernacle. In not so much the tabernacle, and that's where I was actually thinking about that today. Maybe someday we'll do like a deep study into the tabernacle itself because it's so fascinating and amazing. We will talk more about the tabernacle in however many weeks when we get to Hebrews, which is a long time from now, but we'll get there. But we're going to talk mostly next week about the law and the Passover and how Jesus is seen through that. So be back next week. So it's going to be how Christ is seen in this book through all of this is fascinating and amazing. So does anybody have any questions or comments? I know that was a whirlwind. We're going to be able, I believe, to do the next few books, like calling it all in one, because the story, like in Leviticus, isn't as much, So next week we'll do Exodus and then finish Exodus, and then we should be able to get all of Leviticus in one lesson. So, anybody have anything before we close?
Good job. That's a lot to cover.
Lots to cover. Lots to cover. All right, well, I'm going to say goodbye to the online people. We will see you guys next time. And if you have any comments, drop them in there and I will respond. Take care.